Seats as quickly as possible. Thank you. Well, good afternoon and welcome to this session of the Conference on World Affairs. My name is Keith Maskus. I'm the Associate Dean for Social Sciences in the College of Arts and Sciences. And I'm just delighted to introduce Sanho, who will be the speaker this afternoon. I'll just, you have his biography in front of you, but I'll just say a few things here. Mr. Tree is director of the Drug Policy Project, which works to end the domestic and international war on drugs and replace it with policies that promote public health and safety, as well as economic alternatives to the prohibition drug economy. The intersection of race and poverty in the drug war is at the heart of the project's work. And let me just say, he was featured in a recent ABC documentary on the drug war and has also appeared on The Bill Maher Show. I've asked Mr. Tree to speak for about 35 or 40 minutes, which will leave some time for questions from the audience. If you have questions, please keep in mind that we really do want to hear questions rather than speeches from the audience, if you get my drift, because we'd like Mr. Tree to be able to respond to those. Okay, very well. So without further ado, let me just introduce Sanho Tree.
Thank you very much. Thanks, sir. Thanks for coming. I just finished a panel on Afghanistan over at the law school, and so after solving that problem, I thought I'd come here and fix Mexico as well. Boy, some days you just want to, you know, slash your wrists. It's getting kind of depressing. I'm afraid I don't have a whole lot of optimism for the prognosis right now in the short run. But there are some possible ways to salvage the situation, and I'll try to get to that as well in the long term. So. Basically, to frame the issue, what's going on in Mexico right now? You've seen the headlines, lots of killings. The bloodbath is unimaginable. More than 10,000 people have died since President Calderon came into office and escalated the drug war. He inherited a situation where there were already turf battles going on between the Gulf Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel. And what he did was to bring in the army. Because the federal police were thought to be too corrupt, the local police, and that they thought that the army could try to establish some order. And I'll explain later why I think that's a very bad policy. And it has indirect unintended results that can make the problem much worse. But it's important to understand why people are doing what they're doing. Why are people trafficking these drugs? They're fighting over turf battles to trafficking corridors, essentially. They exist because these are the strategic corridors in which you can bribe officials and move large amounts of drugs fairly efficiently. And when you have these kinds of turf battles, it's very counterintuitive, but in terms of violence reduction, as long as we have high demand in places like the United States, and as long as we have the war on drugs, drug prohibition, then the state getting in between a turf battle is possibly one of the worst things you could do, which is a very difficult reality for politicians to face because they want to do something. Daniel Webster once said that the strong notion that something must be done is the parent of many a bad measure, especially if it happens during an election year. I'm serious about this, and I'll get into why that's so toxic. But to give you an example of, at the local level, why you don't see a lot of violence these days associated with a crack economy, right? Remember in the 1980s, crack was like the #1 drug, and there was violence everywhere. What was that violence about? It wasn't just that people were going on binges of crack and committing acts of violence that way. It was more most of the violence was about turf battles. Crack was a new drug. The existing turf lines had not been established in most cities, and therefore you had gang rivalries trying to decide who can traffic which drugs in which neighborhood and that sort of thing. It was about profits. And I think most experienced police chiefs know better than to shut down an open-air drug market, for instance. And that's important because unless you have a good plan B, unless you have a way of reducing the demand for drugs or taking the profits out of this economy somehow, then if you round up a street corner dealer, right, and many constituents, I mean, understandably say, look, there's an open-air drug market in my neighborhood. Here's this guy standing there trafficking drugs. Why don't you arrest him? Well, if you do that, what you've done is created a job opening. You've opened up a very valuable piece of real estate, right? Why is it valuable? Because that's where people know where to go buy drugs, especially people from the suburbs, often, you know, white suburban folks. They can't take out an ad in the yellow pages or put up a billboard saying, you know, we've moved to new drug markets over in this neighborhood now, just come over here to buy your drugs. So that means that street corner is a very valuable piece of real estate, and you will then have rival gangs, 2 or more sometimes, fighting over who gets to control that corner, right? And they can't go to, they can't solve their disputes legally. They can't go to a judge and say, Your Honor, I've been dealing drugs in this neighborhood for 15 years, and this upstart gang from across town moved into my turf. Make him go away. The only way they can resolve their differences is through violence or the threat of violence, and very often very extreme violence. And at the macro level, that's kind of what we're seeing right now in Mexico. That when you have a turf battle going on between cartels, if the state gets in between this, what the cartels are looking for right now is some sort of equilibrium, a modus vivendi, right? This cartel will traffic in this area, this one will go back in this area, and they'll have some arrangement. And the sooner they find that, the sooner the violence goes away. Remember, these cartels are not in the business of killing people. Killing people is bad for business. Any drug trafficker that tries to take a high profile and do these splashy things is not one who is long for this world. And it's very expensive to fight these battles amongst themselves. You run the risk of getting killed yourself or your lieutenants. And by the way, killing off leaders of these cartels and their lieutenants is also counterintuitive, but it's a bad idea. I mean, how many times have we killed the number 2 or number 3 leader of Al-Qaeda? Right? What you do is you create a job opening for number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6, and very often there will be a power struggle. If there's a power struggle within these cartels, there'll be more violence. The sooner they achieve some sort of equilibrium, the sooner they can go back to the quiet business of drug dealing. This is what I told Congress, or congressional staffers, a year and a half ago when they were debating the Merida initiative, pardon my accent. Merida initiative, they didn't want to hear it. It was an election year. And the staffers told me, look, my boss says we have to get this passed. We have to do something. The voters expect it. And the problem with the war on drugs is that the solutions to a lot of these problems are counterintuitive and therefore difficult to frame. What do I mean by counterintuitive? A good example is this sort of thing, right? This is a Mexican finger trap or a Chinese finger cuff, right? Where the harder you pull, the stucker you get. This is the problem with prohibition economics and the war on drugs. It's also the problem with the war on terror and the war on gangs and other wars on social phenomenon that can't surrender, right? And it's counterintuitive to think that, well, maybe the way is not to struggle, but to relax a bit and then gradually extract yourself from the situation. Politicians have a hard time explaining this to voters. They think that your attention span is too short, and they're afraid. They're afraid of negative attack ads. I'm not saying that simply being attacked for being soft on drugs or soft on narco-terrorism in the post-9/11 framework is enough to cost a member of Congress their seat. However, if you're in the position of being a member of Congress, you've got to balance a lot of variables. I've got all this campaign contributions that's kind of controversial. There was that incident with an intern. There was this scandal, this quid pro quo. Do I really want to risk having this kind of a political baggage attached to me? And what they're afraid of are ads that are very easy to run and very cheap to air. And opponents can run them over and over and over again and pummel you in the polls. And so they can run an ad that goes something like this. Say, I want to challenge a liberal from Boulder. Who's your congressman here? Is it Udall? Is it Udall? Okay. Well, let's say I want to run an ad that goes like this. Let's say I want to go and run an ad that goes, friends, Congressman Paul doesn't care if your kids are addicted to drugs. He knows where the drugs are coming from. They're coming from Mexico. They're coming from Colombia. He refused to supply this aid. Come on, folks. We all know where the drugs are coming from. Send me to Washington. I'll approve this aid. We'll go down there and clean up this mess, and I will protect your kids from drugs. Okay. Now, the member of Congress, if you're really lucky, you'll maybe have 60 seconds or 90 seconds on the 6 o'clock news to explain to all your constituents who saw my smear ad run over and over and over again, and hope that they tune in and that your 60-second soundbite is enough to flip the issue and to explain the complex nature of these counterintuitive solutions. So all things being equal, members of Congress tend to shy away from what are called third rail political issues. Right? Third rail is a term, it's a DC term, but it comes from the subway system, right? Two rails carry the train, the third one is high voltage. If you touch it, you're dead. Other third rail issues include aid to Israel, abortion, gay marriage, flag burning amendments, which Karl Rove loves to run those things only during election years, apparently. If flags are only in danger during election years. Those are the kinds of things, and drugs. To me, it's the mother of all third rail political issues. Because the person, the opportunist, the slimy opportunist, automatically has the strategic high ground. It's very easy for me to message why being tough is the answer. But unfortunately, being tough is very often the opposite of being effective. There are a number of reasons for this, and I'll get into a few of them. When our legislators see these kinds of illegal activity, trafficking in drugs, using drugs, growing these crops, et cetera, money laundering, you're breaking the law. Their first instinct is to make you stop breaking the law, and the way they usually do that is by escalating law enforcement. Well, when you have the economics of drug prohibition, however, it compounds things. Number one, the drug economy tends to evolve under Darwinian principles, right? Selection of the fittest. When we keep escalating law enforcement, the kinds of people we tend to capture tend to be the people who are dumb enough to get caught. No offense if anyone's ever been busted for anything here, but the slang on the street, is that the dealer who uses loses. You will get careless, you'll get sloppy, you'll eventually get apprehended. Or in the case of cartels, if you break operational security, if you go too high profile, eventually you'll get taken down. And so the people that we tend to miss when we keep escalating law enforcement decade after decade tend to be the people who are the most efficient, the most innovative, the most adaptive. We have been selectively breeding. We've been artificially selecting for super traffickers, if you will. I used to say this was an unintended consequence, but we've been warning about this for so many years now that I think using the term unintended lets politicians off the hook. They knew this was coming. This wasn't a whoopsie moment here. But it's more accurate to say it's an indirect consequence, because legally speaking, they're liable for their actions, or should be held accountable for their actions when they were warned time and again that prohibition economics has its own built-in contradictions, its catch-22s. Therefore, we cannot hope to win a war on drugs when our policies see to it that only the most efficient operations survive. And not only do they survive, but they thrive because we've done two things, again, unintended or indirectly to help them. Number one, we've eliminated the competition for them. We've picked off the inefficient traffickers, the clumsy cartels. We do away with them, and we opened up this very lucrative space to the efficient traffickers. Number two, we've tried to artificially constrict the supply of drugs on the street while the demand remains constant, thereby driving up prices and profits for the remaining traffickers. Right? And so in a world filled with so much poverty and greed, you will never make these problems go away by making the drugs more valuable, and that's where prohibition economics comes in. It's our policies, and only our policies, that make these drugs so incredibly valuable. When we talk about things like cocaine and heroin and marijuana, these are minimally processed agricultural commodities. They're very easy to grow. There's nothing magical about these plants, and it's insane that we make these things so incredibly valuable. Just to give you an example, we have accomplished what the alchemists of the Middle Ages could never do, turning lead into gold. We have policies that turn weed into gold, basically. If you take the average price of an ounce of marijuana in those days in the United States, and compare that to the 10-year price average of an ounce of pure gold. Past 2 years, gold has skyrocketed, but historically, $300 to $400 range. That's roughly the same as an ounce of marijuana on the streets. We call this stuff weed for a reason. It grows like a weed. There is no reason on earth someone should be able to put a seed in the ground and mint their own gold, right? This is madness. And when we talk about things like cocaine and heroin, they're worth many, many, many times their equivalent weight in solid gold. We think of it this way. The war on drugs, whether through interdiction or eradication, functions as an indirect price support for growers and traffickers. Right? It's a kind of a crop subsidy, if you will. And that is one of the reasons why the more we fight the drug war, the more we lose. There are politicians who have ventured out to try to express these kinds of thoughts. Donald Rumsfeld, to his credit, And you can criticize him for a lot of things, and I certainly do. On the drug war, he was very good. I fought very hard to keep the Pentagon out of the war on drugs, knowing that it's a demand-driven problem and that economics are at the heart of this problem. He also he floated his own think piece memo back in 2003 that got to the media. And one of the things he said, in the war on terror, he said, is it the case that the harder we work, the behinder we get? That's the problem with the drug war. The more you fight it, the more valuable the drugs become. The more valuable the drugs become, the more poor peasants are going to be drawn into growing these crops, and the more greedy people and traffickers will get into trafficking these drugs. So we build the reward mechanism in there quite dramatically. To give you another example of how this economics works, you can buy a kilo of pure cocaine on the streets of Medellin, Colombia for about $1,500 a kilo, give or take. It fluctuates a little bit, but not a whole lot. $1,500. By the time you got it to the streets of Denver, the streets of Washington, D.C., and by the time the dealers distribute it at the gram level, and they dilute it with whatever garbage they cut the stuff with, and they put it in little gram bags, you can get about $100,000 to $150,000 for that exact same kilogram, right? What the users are paying for then are essentially transportation costs, or rather the risks associated with transportation. And so the higher the likelihood they might get captured and apprehended, and the longer and tougher the prison sentence they might have to serve, the higher the risk premium they're allowed to charge, the risk reward. They're allowed to, and the market will bear a tremendous amount of escalation. And so it actually helps their profits. So they're able to charge far more to the next person down the line, right? And so attacking this from a supply side is about as effective as shoveling water. And attacking it with military force, as President Calderon has done, is like getting between two giant hornets' nests and taking a baseball bat, in this case the military, and swinging at these hornets' nests like a piñata. And now we're crying out, oh my God, there are hornets everywhere, and they're really angry. This is the same thing we've done in Colombia, right? In 2000, we knew that there was a hornet's nest in southern Colombia. There was a lot of coca, there was guerrillas, and so we launched Plan Colombia. We thought we'd go down there and solve this problem militarily. 80% militarized aid under Plan Colombia. And we beat that hornet's nest, and now there's coca growing all over Colombia, not just in the south. And we have going after these cartels is also, again, the other indirect consequence is that you might recall, for instance, the Medellin cartel, the Cali cartel, back in the 1980s and 90s. These are the dreaded gigantic cocaine cartels that once ruled the cocaine economy of the world, right? And so we fought them, and we got a lot of people in the Colombian military and security forces to help us do this. A lot of brave people died in the process. And you think, well, we dismantled those two giant cartels. That should have done the trick. That should have at least put a giant dent in this problem, no? More drugs than ever came out of Colombia. So what happened? Well, this is the kind of hubris you run into in Washington, where politicians want easy answers. And what we did is we destroyed the two big monopolies. And we opened up this incredibly lucrative economic space to now dozens, if not hundreds, of smaller trafficking organizations. Many of them family-run, vertically integrated, each with their own list of officials they bribe, their own smuggling routes. We can't even count the number of smaller operations now, much less try to infiltrate and disrupt them. So that's the problem with going after the big fish. You end up democratizing this economic space. And going after the little fish, you end up breeding super traffickers, right? It's a lot like how public health professionals say you shouldn't overuse antibiotics every time you have a sore throat. You shouldn't use those antibacterial cleansers and soaps and things, because what you end up doing is killing off the weak strains of bacteria and allowing the drug-resistant strains, the really bad ones, to multiply and take over in that space. That's somewhat analogous to what we've been doing with the drug war for many decades now. We can't hope to win a war on drugs by rewarding efficiency. This is what we've been doing. And so, the political problem in Washington. Again, this was an election year. I think drug policies should never be debated during election years. Neither should gay marriage, neither should abortion, neither should any of these third-rail political issues be debated during election years, as long as we have our current method of campaigning, our current political culture. It is a technique that Karl Rove has really perfected. He took what were old wedge issues and refined them, exploited them to perfection. He even coined his own term. He called them anger points. right? What are the kinds of issues that will boil the blood of his Christian conservative base and get them out there to vote year after year and keep the Republican, what he thought was going to be the permanent Republican majority? And it was these kinds of social issues that are very complex to message, and the answers, the solutions are more difficult to explain, and that you can count on enough voters falling for the easy answers so that you've got your political opponents on the defensive. I think, one of my favorite popular philosophers put it well. Last name Simpson, first name Bartholomew. Bart Simpson, I think you could learn a lot of life's lessons by watching The Simpsons. At some point or another, they'll get around to expressing it. But Bart Simpson, I think, captured the problem very well. He ran for class president, and he began with an opening attack speech on his opponent. And he says, "My opponent says there are no easy answers. Well, I say he's not looking hard enough." This is the problem with Congress. They're looking for the easy answers. And unfortunately, the easy answers are usually the wrong ones when it comes to these seemingly intractable problems, these third-rail issues. That there's a reason why they keep vexing us year after year. We're never able to deal with them, and that's because politicians are afraid of these issues. After 11 years of studying this issue and working on Capitol Hill and talking with legislators and their staffs, both Republican and Democrat, it's something that's enough to make you very cynical. I am optimistic, however, for changes coming, but privately the discourse is one thing, and publicly they vote a different way. And they come to me in hushed tones, and they want to know about, well, what do you think about legalization or decriminalization or regulation? What if you just tax this stuff and spend it on treatment? Isn't that a great idea? Would that work? And they always whisper it, like they're the only ones who's thought of that. And if I were a little less ethical, I would out them all, and they would realize they're the majority. And that leads to what I think is a possible solution to this intractable problem of third-rail issues, which is that, again, the solution is counterintuitive, that you would get more reasonable policies, more responsive and reality-based policies if you had less accountability in Congress. What am I smoking, right? What I mean by this is temporarily give them less accountability. The Prime Minister of Luxembourg, I think he phrased it quite well. He was talking about trade issues at the time in Luxembourg, which were at that time quite controversial domestically. And he said, look, we all know what needs to be done. We just don't know how to get reelected after we've done it. That's the problem with the drug war. And so if you gave them a veil of anonymity, a temporary one, Oscar Wilde once said, if you give a man a mask, he will tell you the truth. What I want to do is give Congress a temporary mask for 15 minutes to have a procedural exercise, a non-binding straw poll, a secret poll, where for 15 minutes, for one brief moment, you can actually vote what's truly in your heart, what you truly believe is in the best interest of your constituents, as well as your future generations, right? Instead of short-term politics. This is what our politics has degenerated into. Everyone's concerned about short-term interests. Every politician knows exactly what his or her constituents expect, what their political donors want, what their party leadership expects of them. And so for this 15-minute procedural exercise, you can have a veil of conscience, instead of a veil of ignorance, right? Where they can finally express themselves. It's kind of like, I call it a theory of a distributed responsibility. It's kind of like a traditional firing squad, where one person in the firing squad is given a blank, and no one knows who has the blank, right? So they can sleep a little bit more comfortably at night, I guess, that maybe they didn't commit murder. But if no one knows that you were the person who voted against these issues, you can't be scapegoated, you can't be smeared politically. And as long as one person votes in the minority, no one knows it wasn't you, right? And a secret ballot has a lot of uses. It's good enough to select a Secretary General of the United Nations. It's good enough to select the Pope. There are reasons for these kinds of things. We want people's genuine, honest beliefs about these issues, not their political machinations and scheming and covering their rears. And so by doing this, you get more honesty, and more accountability in the long run. And the purpose of having a non-binding straw poll is that, you know, the Constitution gives us the right to have a recorded vote on these things, and we should be able to know how our representatives have voted. But again, there are many liberal interest groups, for instance, that want to record all votes in Congress and have it easily accessible on a website. How many of you have actually gone to your member of Congress's website and to look at which way they voted? Very few people, not the majority of voters. Well, this is a particularly energized and I think politically engaged group, but as a whole, the population doesn't really look at, doesn't really follow these things very closely. The reason they record so many votes and the way politics has changed since the early 1970s when Congress instituted electronic voting, it became much easier to record every vote. And since then, we've had then more and more demands for recorded votes on every obscure amendment. It's not so that their constituents can hold them accountable, it's so each party can hold the other accountable at election time. It gives you a recorded vote. Remember John Kerry, how he was attacked? Well, first he voted for it before he voted against it, the war funding, right? And it's very easy to take those kinds of things out of context, much as Bill O'Reilly has done with this conference. I know this from personal experience. It's very easy to take things completely out of context, twist them around in these negative smear ads, and really destroy someone's reputation. And so this is a way of bypassing that, of separating politics from public policy. And ultimately, we need to have responsible politicians who are going to look out for the best interests of not just for themselves and their constituents, but future generations. I mean, who is the lobbyist for you know, your children, your grandchildren, your great-great-great-grandchildren? Whose job is it in our government to say, wait a minute, are these policies on the environment, on the economy, on military spending, are these really in the best interest in the future, for future generations? Are we doing them justice by doing these things? No, it's all about short-term politics. It's been a real breath of fresh air living in Washington to have the Obama administration come in, because I think he is the first politician to really be able to take on these third-rail issues, who is gifted enough as a communicator to explain to constituents, to take the time to try to speak to you as an adult. Right? They don't hate us for our freedom. I mean, come on. How can anyone get away with these kinds of answers? And I think that's paying off for him politically. And he's become quite popular as a result of it. And I hope that leads other politicians to move beyond the culture wars. I think the results of this past election have shown that the culture war is nearing an end, or at least this incarnation of it. For too long, the war on drugs has been fought as a culture war, especially in the past 8 years. And the culture war is something, at least for this generation, is I think a schism that came out of the Vietnam era. And it was that divide that happened in the 1960s in this country that was so profound and so deep. Many of you may not realize that because you were probably on the progressive side of that culture war. But imagine if you were on the other side. Right? If you are traditionalists and you see these people burning their bras and their draft cards and smoking pot and protesting the government and you know, integration and all these things, the world that you grew up with as a conservative white male, you know, is suddenly turned upside down, and that bitterness has plagued us for many, many generations. What caused John Kerry's defeat? Right? It wasn't the Iraq War; it was the Vietnam War. Right? What caused Michael Dukakis to go up in flames? It was the culture war issue of crime. Willie Horton. You know, Bill Clinton also played into this game. Barack Obama is the first post-culture war president we've had in this country. Even though he was born during the time of the Vietnam War, he came of age post-Vietnam War. And I often wonder if drugs had you know, come onto the national scene at any other decade other than the Vietnam War, we'd have a different kind of culture war, or a different kind of drug policy in this country. But these things became fused together, so that the way you stood on Vietnam, the way you stood on the sexual revolution or feminism or drug policy, you know, probably carried over into a number of these other issues. And it became a very powerful wedge that people like Karl Rove could exploit very efficiently. And I'm glad that we're starting to mature and move beyond that. Not mature. Well, yes, John McCain's generation is maturing and getting a little older to hold office. And the demographic that really moved this election were the under 30s, right? And they I can't see what the fuss is about. They grew up in a very different reality. I'm often reminded of the issue of like gays in the military. Remember when Bill Clinton tried to do that in the early 90s, right? He got his ass handed to him by the Republicans, right? And politicians have very reptilian brains. You know, fire, burn, bad, stay away. And it's plagued them, right? And they think the gay issue is one that is just, oh, toxic. You must not, you know, look what happened to Clinton. Don't do that. Well, they don't realize that today, the young recruits who are entering the military were literally in diapers when that gays in the military, don't ask, don't tell stuff came about. And they grew up in a very different reality. They grew up watching, you know, Friends and Will and Grace and Seinfeld. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but and they don't understand what this culture war issue is about. I mean, what's this cooties issue? You know, it's like, yeah, hey, this is normal. And so I think culturally we're starting to evolve past this, and I think that's going to have a very significant impact on our drug policies. In fact, I know it is. This past week, I brought 3 people from Colombia up to Washington, D.C. to have meetings with members of Congress, as well as people in the State Department and the Drug Czar's office. And the reception that they got was fundamentally different than any reception we've had in the past 8 years. First of all, the State Department and Drug Czar's office wouldn't even return I don't think they would have even spoken to me or returned my calls 6 months ago. And President Obama, when he gave his instructions to his Mideast envoy to shut up and listen, I think it went system-wide because many more doors are opening. They don't know what their policies are yet, what their directives will be, so they haven't willing to debate, but they're listening now. And that's a huge step forward. Same on Capitol Hill. I talked to a prominent Democratic senator. His staff person on the Drugs and Crime Subcommittee, his counsel, was a former public defender. And I thought, you know, it was almost an unwritten law that you had to be a former prosecutor to be on these kinds of committees. And that's a change. We finally realized that we can't arrest and incarcerate and coerce our way out of this problem. And we paid such a terrible price for this domestically, and others are paying a far heavier price abroad. But just to give you a sense of the dimensions of this, in the United States, we now have 2.4 million people behind bars in this country. Okay, there are only about 9 million prisoners on planet Earth. What that means is the U.S. has 5% of the world's population, less than 5% of the world's population, and more than 25% of the planet's prisoners. We operate the largest penal system on planet Earth. We incarcerate more than any other country, both in absolute numbers and per capita numbers. And of those 2.4 million people behind bars, about a quarter of them are there for non-violent drug offenses. That 500,000 or so people is more than we had in our entire prison system in 1980. The explosion of our incarceration is a direct result of the war on drugs and our draconian drug laws. In Mexico and in Colombia, in Afghanistan, we see the price that people are paying on the ground. This is an awful lot of blood to shed over minimally processed agricultural commodities. And with that, I'll leave you and I'll try to answer some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tree. I should have mentioned earlier that he's quite a prolific blogger and op-ed writer. So if you would like to hear more or read more, visit his website at the Institute for Policy Studies. Let me just begin by offering one observation, which is to say, if we really had this wonderful 15 minutes in which Congress could adopt rational solutions to all of these difficult problems, it would be a very busy 15 minutes. I would like to open the floor now to questions. If anyone would like to suggest, there's at least the one microphone to come up to. Yes, sir.
It's kind of a question about patriots for profit. I don't know if you recall, but Iran-Contra, the crack epidemic, was kind of tied together with the Middle East, I guess, drug cartel, working with the United States, bringing that in. Kind of goes back to, I guess, the Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia. And that kind of like the Covert Action Quarterly, I used to read some of those articles kind of touching on that. And so I guess my question is, with what's going on now in Afghanistan, why it just kind of seems like we're giving the drug cartels their free reign and supplying the Taliban with resources to continue the fight there. And what might we, I mean, you get this stigma if you deal with drugs, but if you use it for a greater purpose, is that still an evil in and of itself for doing that? So thank you.
If you don't mind, I'm going to pass on the Afghanistan. I just spoke in an Afghanistan panel but we'll focus on Mexico. But yes, the issue of the CIA Contra cocaine controversies going back to Southeast Asia and China during the 1960s, the CIA has, in fact, looked the other way or worked with drug traffickers. And it's not because they want to chemically enslave African Americans, as some of the conspiracy theory goes, but rather that this was a way of minting your own money and funding illegal wars, wars that Congress would not fund, that were not allowed. And so there's a history of that. I don't think that's what's driving things today. I don't think that's there's a grand conspiracy today. But historically, yeah, we have to acknowledge that. In fact, there was a memorandum of understanding between William Casey and William French Smith, the head of the CIA and the Attorney General under Reagan, where they explicitly exempted CIA from having to report dealings with drug traffickers when they listed all these other crimes, kidnapping, counterfeiting, all these crimes, and they explicitly ruled out drug trafficking. So, I mean, it's pretty damning, that kind of evidence. But again, it was to raise money, not to chemically enslave African Americans through crack or whatever. It's not. Most people in CIA in Langley, Virginia, don't know where South Central Los Angeles is, and I don't think they care, quite frankly. They just wanted the money to overthrow the Sandinistas at that time.
Mr. Tree, I had a question. How are we going to handle Mexico's collapse here in the United States? Thank you.
Good. What can be done in Mexico? I think going after the cartels it's a bad idea. No politician wants to hear this, but this prohibition-related violence has gotten so extreme that other sectors of the criminal world are now pushing the envelope, trying to explore what else can they get away with, right? And because the drug war has gotten so out of hand, other people, kidnappers, people doing home invasion, common crime is now becoming quite prevalent, and it's moving into the United States as well. Phoenix, Arizona is now the kidnapping capital of the United States. That is something that the state can and should go after, and you don't have the indirect consequences of going after something in drug prohibition. You can round up a lot of kidnappers. It doesn't make all the other remaining potential kidnap victims more valuable. If, however, you rounded up half the heroin dealers in the United States, what would happen to the other half in terms of the profits? It would skyrocket, right? That's the nature of common crime versus prohibition-related crime. And I think the state needs to do, both the United States and the Colombian state needs very urgently to go after those kinds of criminals. Because when the social fabric of Mexican society starts to come apart, it can come apart fairly quickly. It's not going to become a failed state, I don't think. I think it's fairly alarmist by military and some other institutions that have an vested interest in perhaps in their budgets. But Mexico has a long history and strong other institutions, but they're going to live with a lot of crime. And Mexico today reminds me of Colombia in the 1990s, where you had vigilante groups that became the death squads, the paramilitaries in Colombia, who are now major drug traffickers as well, and on our State Department's terrorist groups list. And that's now starting to form in Mexico because they think the state is unable to protect people, so they're going to hire vigilantes to do it. It's important to take those unraveling threads and try to mend them quickly, because if it starts to degenerate more, the whole civic culture, the idea that we're in this together as a nation, that we should pay taxes, that the state can provide some minimum amount of security for us, begins to go up in smoke, much as it is done in Colombia, where security and other things become privatized. And it takes a long time to rebuild that ethic. And so states can cause, suffer a lot of damage very quickly, and it takes a lot more time to rebuild.
Recently, there was an internet town hall where people got to ask President Obama questions, and a very popular internet question was about legalizing marijuana. Also, when a talk radio station introduces legalizing marijuana as a topic, they get a huge influx of calls. I wonder if you wanted to comment on the internet and the culture and how it's changing with that. The drug warriors say that marijuana is a gateway, and I happen to believe them. It's a gateway to becoming president. The last 3 presidents of the United States, every president since 1993 has violated our drug laws, enough to serve a very long prison sentence if they were so caught. What is the lesson they're trying to send to our children? That the lesson is don't get caught?
And you know, if a good stiff prison sentence would not have helped them in their lives and their careers, then why is it so good for everyone else, particularly poor people and people of color, because that's who's filling our prison system. We have people like Newt Gingrich, who admitted to using marijuana more than once. Al Gore smoked for 5 years, he admits. I can prove 10 years. I talked to someone who actually has his roach clip from the 70s. But Senator Lincoln Chafee, a Republican, now revealed that he had used cocaine many times and still got elected. But he's a liberal Republican from Rhode Island, no longer in Congress. But many members of Congress, legislators, both Democrat and Republican, have themselves violated the drug laws, either as youthful indiscretion or perhaps more recently. And that calls into question then their own legitimacy to incarcerate other people for similar offenses. Obama, I think he gets it about the drug war. It's very hard to be a community organizer in South Chicago and not get it. It's pretty much in your face in terms of there is no substitute for building a healthy society. If you really want to help keep people off of drugs, then give them a reason to look forward to tomorrow. And instead, our solution has been to be, you know, to these communities to say, no, you need to be sober and have no job and no hope and no future and no opportunity. That will never work. However, there is no doubt that there is a huge groundswell, and particularly because of the violence in Mexico, is forcing people, including lots of columnists, media people who are outing themselves now, saying they believe in legalization. Joel Klein was the last one in Primary Colors, the guy who wrote that in Time magazine, wrote one on legalization. Kathleen Parker, conservative Republican columnist, also. I mean, you can't swing a cat without hitting some columnist or leading official now who's saying we should legalize. I'll tell you who. Barry McCaffrey, General Barry McCaffrey, right, who is President Clinton's drug czar, was asked in a forum at the Council on Foreign Relations on Mexico back in February. Someone said, well, why don't you just legalize it? And he says, well, you know, now that I'm no longer in public life, I can tell you, I frankly don't care. I care about 6th graders to 12th graders, as do I. But if you're a 40-year-old guy living in Oregon with a dozen pot plants growing in your backyard, knock yourself out. Those were his words. This was the drug czar. And I wish he had said that before he condemned this hemisphere to decades of bloody drug war. And will we have to wait until our current politicians are retired and no longer in public life before they too can speak honestly about these issues? I hope not. But I think it was a bad timing to force this question on Obama. He cannot afford to use his political capital right now at this particular moment when he has so many issues to deal with, and the Republicans are in complete disarray and trying to grab any issue they can to attack him with. This is the worst possible time to force that issue upon him. There will be a better time for this, but not right now, I'm afraid.
Hi. I'm wondering how the drug war in Colombia has affected the current state Mexico is in.
The current state Mexico is in? Well, it's a long story, but to make it short, the drugs that were coming from Colombia, originally marijuana, we waged a war on marijuana in the 1980s under Reagan, and the smugglers realized, well, we got something else here that's a lot more profitable, compact, it's not big and smelly and bulky like these giant bales of marijuana. That, of course, was cocaine. They began smuggling cocaine throughout the Caribbean, and it was our success at interdicting the drugs in the Caribbean that allowed the traffickers to then to explore overland routes, particularly going through Central America, Guatemala, Mexico, and the Mexicans are now getting into the act where in recent years are taking over that trafficking. They're no longer just operating at the behest of Colombians, but they're doing it themselves. The Colombians are also now experimenting with, or not experimenting, they're using submarines. Dozens of submarines and semi-submersibles have been captured now. God knows how many have gotten through. And just to give you an idea of how brazen this can be, in 2000, they discovered a submarine built by Russian engineers. They found the blueprints that was still not quite completed yet in Bogota, Colombia. If you know anything about Colombia, Bogota is 8,000 feet high in the Andes. It's in the middle of the country, not near any ocean. That's how brazen it is, that they could build a submarine and get it to the ocean. And that's probably not that's certainly not the first one they captured. So it's going after drugs in drug smuggling routes. We run into the Hydra effect, you know, the mythical creature. You cut off one head, two heads sprout in its place. We do that with drugs. If you're somehow magically able to seal the U.S.-Mexico border, they will do more smuggling along the shorelines. You get to Alaska. Alaska has so much shoreline that's unpoliced. Once you get drugs, land drugs onto those shores, you're in the territorial United States. You don't have to worry about customs. You can fly domestically. You can do all kinds of things. It's a losing proposition. It's simply impossible in a free society of 300 million people, 100 million of whom have broken our drug laws, according to the government estimates, and try to police private consensual conduct.
I have another question. How is corruption in the government? How do you deal with that?
That is a very difficult question because the drug prohibition is an equal opportunity corrupter. For the same reason J. Edgar Hoover did not want his boys in blue, his Aryan FBI, to get involved in alcohol prohibition. He saw, or the drug war, he saw how corrupting that was. And that corruption is a difficult, it's perhaps not an appropriate phrase to use for certain situations in Colombia or Mexico, because what they'll do is they make you an offer. If you're a government official in rural Colombia, for instance, or a small town in Mexico, the traffickers will make you a deal, plomo or plato. Do you want lead or do you want silver? And in Colombia, you have something like a 98% impunity rate for politically motivated crimes, right? Which means I can have you whacked and nothing will happen to me. Given those kinds of odds, that's not a threat, that's a promise. And the question is, do you want to see the sun rise the next day? Do you want to kiss your children goodbye? Is that corruption or is that self-preservation? There's simply too much money involved in this economy, and that's ultimately what brought down alcohol prohibition. I think that's what's going to bring down drug prohibition, that these are minimally processed agricultural commodities. This shouldn't be happening.
Yeah,
one aspect on corruption. Congress and our politicians like to say these things are shared responsibilities. We're going to help train Mexican forces to help fight this war for us or with us. We've been burned so many times in the past. The most feared enforcers of any cartel are the Zetas, the Gulf Cartel. The Zetas were formerly an elite counter-narcotics commando unit funded and trained by U.S. Special Forces in the 1990s. We thought they would fight the drug war for us. In the mid-90s, a number of them decided, well, we can go freelance, we can privatize our enterprise, and they became the enforcers for the Gulf Cartel. These are the ones who took our specialized training and our weapons and refined it for themselves. They adapted this. They are now recruiting their own people, giving them that specialized training, and they're using bazookas, they're using 50 caliber sniper rifles, they're using rocket propelled grenades. This is getting completely out of hand. We got burned this way in Guatemala as well. The Caibiles, another elite unit, also turned. Many of them turned and worked with the traffickers. In Colombia, we saw this happen again and again. In Chicago during alcohol prohibition. I mean, it goes on and on and on. So unless you can guarantee the loyalty of the people you're training, it only takes one or two bad apples to reveal all the secrets to the opposition, and then you're screwed.
When Obama came in to power, he pledged to end the Bush policy of the feds persecuting and prosecuting medical marijuana providers in the states where it's legal. John Stossel last week on 2020 had a story about how the prosecutions continue. Particularly, there's one in California where a guy was convicted this year, faces 100 years in prison, has been bankrupted, and was doing nothing illegal from the state level. Do you think Obama is serious, or was he just, is it all just talk?
I think Obama is serious. I think Eric Holder was serious when he promised it, and the DEA then launched another raid a week after I think Eric Holder, announced his new policy. The Attorney General, the DEA. I think as I recall, the response was, "We haven't received explicit orders to the contrary yet until a directive." These are bureaucrats. They will do what they're told to do. And their existing directives come from the Bush administration, Bush era. Until they get new orders, they're like robots. And most bureaucracies get rewarded, very often on the wrong kind of metrics, meaningless metrics. How many people have you arrested? How many kilos have you interdicted? How many hectares of crops have you eradicated? Rather than how many people have you gotten into treatment? How many farmers have you gotten to switch to alternative development? How many, meaningful metrics. So they get rewarded on body count. Very often, and there's also a lot of zealots. After 8 years of the Bush administration, they've managed to politicize so many aspects of the civil service, career civil service positions that weren't supposed to be ideologically driven, but are filled with fanatics now. And so I think Eric Holder probably is drafting, has drafted very concrete orders now to DEA to make it very clear to them what they can and can't do. However, there are still federal laws on the books in terms of if they violate even California's own very liberal marijuana laws, if they're selling to minors without parental consent, without prescription, et cetera, in these medical marijuana clinics, then the feds do have the ability then to conduct raids. I don't know that
well, no,
happens.
Stossel made the point that the state first tried, and they couldn't find anything on the guy. They turned it over to the feds, and
With
the
that
feds just
particular
busted
case,
him.
yes. Yeah. There's another raid on a different one, but anyway.
I think we're going to have to limit this to just 2 more questions. I'm sorry, but we've already run out of time.
Yeah, ideally and practically, what policy
Okay.
Please go ahead.
We got signals, we can take the rest of the people in line. Go ahead. Sorry.
Ideally and practically, what policy should replace the current policy?
Ooh, okay, you asked the easy question. I don't know what the ideal drug policy for this country would be. I know what the contours of such a policy might look like. We know what's worked in other states, particularly in Western Europe and other places, but those models aren't necessarily transportable. We have a different culture, different political economy. We have a very weak social safety net compared to, say, Amsterdam. Ultimately, there is no substitute for building a healthy society, and that's something we've neglected to do. So reforming drug laws has to go hand in hand with social investment and giving people a reason to look forward to tomorrow. Too many people believe their best days are behind them, and that's increasingly true because of the economy. But when you look at the problems of drugs and drug abuse and addiction, I mean, I constantly come back to issues that are rooted in poverty, despair, and alienation. Poverty is the easy one. Everyone can point to that. You can see it. But despair and alienation cut across class lines, and we have to look at why people choose to self-medicate at such alarmingly high levels. Ultimately, I think the real illness we suffer from is modernity itself, that we have evolved in a very unnatural and unhealthy way that's unsustainable. And it's a wonder to me that more people don't self-medicate, quite frankly. We've constructed a soulless society in a secular sense, and we're paying the price for that. But when the year I was born, President Lyndon Johnson began his war on poverty, the Great Society programs, right? But he had to make a guns or butter choice pretty quickly because another war was competing for his resources and attention. That was the Vietnam War. And guess which one won out? Vietnam. All the money went to that. The war on poverty, the Great Society never really got off the ground. And many generations have been born into, again, conditions of poverty, despair, and alienation. We're at that crossroads again. Are we going to hire more police, more prosecutors, build more prisons to deal with the drug problem, which is about as effective as digging more graves to solve the international AIDS crisis, right? It solves nothing. Or are we finally going to start investing in our infrastructure, in our schools, in our job training programs, giving people a chance at a better life? Ultimately, that's the best way to keep people off of drugs.
I was wondering, are there models in foreign countries for overcoming the barriers to better better drug laws, and how would they relate to our current state?
Yeah, in the parliamentary systems, it's different, different dynamics at play. It's, members of parliament usually vote party line, right? So, and when they campaign as party members. Look at all the lawn signs here in the United States during campaign season. Look at the TV ads. How many of them mention the political party of the candidate? Can you recall any one that does? There's a reason for that. The voters are so ignorant that they hope that they can dupe some of the people from the opposing party to vote for them. And you rise or fall based on your own credentials, your own reputation, and so that you be singled out as an individual and attacked rather than your party. So in parliamentary systems, they will attack the entire party, but people don't vote on single issues to elect or to toss out a single party. It's a complex constellation of issues. So it insulates them more, and it allows then more room for the committees within parliamentary systems to study these things, to have evidence-based policies, and they can debate them a bit more rationally. And they also have a better education system, quite frankly, in terms of people's political literacy and having a more adult conversation about these things.
I've heard a lot of talk about a highway running from Canada into Mexico through the United States, and I was wondering whether or not you think that those are, or the plans are in the works, and what you think the effects of that would have on the United States drug policy.
No, I don't think that's there's a lot of conspiracy theories around this corridor. Some of it may have some grains of truth, etc. There's a security prosperity initiative or whatever, the security thing for the three countries. I have a colleague who works on that. I don't. I'll tell you the real thing that really that caused so many problems was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Right, which is designed to move commodities across that border very quickly and efficiently. And when you have so many tractor trailers going across that border every single hour, it's impossible to stop and search all these things. And you think about a truck with hundreds and thousands of cans of 5-gallon cans of tomatoes, and just a couple of them need to be filled with drugs to make a huge return on your investment. Not to mention the fact that we build a fence. Well, smugglers are now using ultralights. They can stay below the radar and above the fence. I mean, it's a cat and mouse game that it's a losing proposition, because the more we fight it, the more valuable, the greater the incentive we give to the drug traffickers. NAFTA also came and boomeranged around us. Someday I'd like to see a panel at the Conference on World Affairs on corn, just the issue of corn, and how that has screwed us so much. This was originally a very good thing, but corn, if you look at rural life in Mexico, for centuries, for generations, centered around agrarian cycles. Your culture, your practices, your tradition, your values were based on that lifestyle. NAFTA comes along. Our geniuses, our trade experts in Washington say, we know how to solve this. It's just an issue of economics. We can grow corn more cheaply. Your people don't have to do that anymore. That'll free them up to go work in sweatshops or cross the border, documented or undocumented. And so these people who've rooted themselves in a stable culture and life ways for so many generations are uprooted. They can't afford to grow corn. They lose their land. They're thrust into new urban realities, either in Mexico or the United States. And they're thrust into this reality of concrete, steel, petroleum, silicon, that they have not evolved the tradition, the customs, the wisdom to navigate this new reality. Neither have we, for that matter, but that's another matter. And as a result, people are cut off from that cultural culture. As I get older, I get more conservative when I'm thinking about culture. Culture is there. It's good in many ways, because those traditions act as a keel to keep the ship of society from tipping over too radically. Things change so quickly now that I don't even call what we have culture anymore. I call it fashion. It moves so rapidly. And there is something to be said for the reactionary objections of Christian conservatives, Islamic fundamentalists, that modernity is moving so rapidly. No one is stopping to ask, is this the right way to go? The Iroquois, right, would have, their elders would think, well, how would this policy affect the 7th generation? That's how long they think ahead. We think in 2-year election cycles. Our corporations think in quarters. If you don't hit your quarterly numbers, you're finished. And our pace of life and our political process and our cultural change has accelerated so quickly that it's spun out of control. But because we see this all around us, we think, oh, this is normal. This is the way things are supposed to be. The hell it is. We have created this madness around us, and we think it's normal. Well, the last one to recognize the existence of water, according to an old African proverb, is the fish. We are swimming in this modernity that we created. It's an experiment. We have no more than 1 or 2 generations of data to tell us whether or not this experiment is working, and the early returns show that it's not. And so if you want to talk about the matrix, you're living in it. It's not on the screen. You're living in the matrix. Snap out of it. Look at other societies. Look at how they live, what their values are, what their customs are, how they're able to sustain themselves over countless generations. I find myself looking at more and more at indigenous cultures around the world, not to romanticize them, but to go back to basics. What really matters in life? And start from there again. I'm a Reconstructionist. I'm not a reformer. I'm not a revolutionary. I'm looking at the multi-generational long haul back to a sustainable, sane world. Thank you.